Difference between red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. What is red bone marrow? Red bone marrow contains hematopoietic tissue. The main function of red bone marrow is to produce all types of blood cells such as RBCs, WBCs, and platelets. At the time of birth, all bone marrow is red, but with the passage of age, it is replaced by the yellow bone marrow. With age, the level of red bone marrow decreases. Almost 2.6 kilograms of bone marrow is present in adults and half of it is red bone marrow. Red bone marrow can be found in the spongy bones of the skull, spine, ribs, shoulder blades, sternum and at the end of the long bones in legs and arms in adults. Red bone marrow is filled in the spaces of the trabeculae plates in the spongy bones. Two types of the stem cells are produced by the hematopoietic stem cells of the bone marrow, which are lymphoid stem cells and myeloid stem cells. Lymphoid stem cells are differentiated into red blood cells, whereas myeloid stem cells are differentiated into white blood cells. Red bone marrow has all developmental stages of most of the blood cells. When these blood cells become mature, they are released into the circulation. Red bone marrow also assists as filters for damaged and aged blood cells and removes them from the blood circulation. All blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow, so it is richly supplied with the blood. What is yellow bone marrow? Yellow bone marrow is rich with fat. It primarily occurs in the marrow cavity of the long bones. The yellow bone marrow is formed from red bone marrow. At the age of 5 years, red bone marrow in the marrow cavity is converted into the yellow bone marrow. With age, the level of yellow bone marrow increases. The fat is stored in the cell called adipocytes and can be consumed in extreme hunger. The fat of the yellow bone marrow is the last source of the body's energy. It helped to provide sustenance and maintained a balanced environment for the bone to function, but in certain conditions such as insignificant blood loss, yellow bone marrow is converted into the red bone marrow to produce blood cells. It can also be converted into cartilage and compact bones. It has an inadequate blood supply compared with the red bone marrow. The lipids which are stored in the yellow bone marrow are called marrow fats and are physiologically different from brown and white adipose tissue and enhance with age, in a gender-specific manner in various disease conditions such as spinal cord injury and starvation. This increase in marrow fat levels decreases the ratio of HSCs to adipocytes, which is called bone marrow cellularity. In some conditions such as sickle cell disease or high altitude, the count of HSCs is upregulated, increasing bone marrow cellularity. Red bone marrow versus yellow bone marrow. Red bone marrow is also named as medulla osseum rubra, whereas yellow bone marrow is also named as medulla osseum flava. Red bone marrow is present inside the spongy bone, whereas yellow bone marrow is present inside the compact bone. Red bone marrow produces blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, whereas yellow bone marrow produces fats, cartilage, and bones. Cells of the red bone marrows actively divide to produce blood cells, whereas the cells in the yellow bone marrow store fats and produce blood cells. Hemoglobin gives the red color to the red bone marrow, whereas the carotenoids in the fat droplets provide the yellow color to the yellow bone marrow. Red bone marrow is present throughout the skeleton during the fetal life, whereas, with age, yellow bone marrow takes the place of red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is present in the ribs, skull, spine, shoulder blade and at the end of long bones, whereas yellow bone marrow is present in the marrow cavity of the long bones. Main difference. The main difference between red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow is that red bone marrow occurs between the trabeculae of spongy bones, whereas yellow bone marrow occurs in the marrow cavity of the long bones. Conclusion. It has concluded that yellow bone marrow is formed from red bone marrow, and both types of bone marrows differ from each other based on functions and some characteristics. Thanks for watching.